The blade sank through the pumpkin's flesh with a sound that shouldn't have been wet. Marcus Brennan felt resistance where there should have been none, heard something shift inside the massive gourd that made his stomach drop. He'd been growing prize pumpkins for 37 years, had won county fairs across 3 states, but nothing in all those decades had prepared him for what spilled onto his barn floor that October morning. By the time his hands stopped shaking enough to call the sheriff, the sun had climbed high enough to illuminate exactly what kind of legacy his father had left buried in the family fields. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Brennan farm occupied 240 acres of bottomland in rural Indiana, where the soil ran so dark and rich it looked almost black after rain. 5 generations had worked this ground, their sweat and dreams seeping into earth that produced corn, soybeans, and in recent years, pumpkins so massive they required forklift assistance to move. The farmhouse sat at the property's heart, a weathered 2-story structure whose white paint had given way to bare wood in places, creating a patchwork appearance that Marcus's late wife had always meant to fix. She'd been gone 4 years now, and the peeling paint remained, a visual reminder of all the things he kept meaning to do but somehow never got around to finishing. Marcus had turned 63 that spring, his body carrying the accumulated wear of decades spent coaxing life from stubborn ground. His hands were gnarled as old roots, his back complained with every bend, and his knees made sounds like gravel shifting whenever he climbed stairs. But his mind remained sharp, his dedication to the craft of growing things unwavering, even as farming became increasingly difficult for men his age, without sons, to inherit the burden. His daughter Emma had left for Chicago 15 years ago, traded overalls for business suits, swapped sunrise chores for conference calls. She visited twice a year, always with the same careful expression that said, she loved him, but not this life, not these fields, not the weight of continuing something just because it had always been done. The giant pumpkin had been his project for the entire growing season, an obsession that consumed his attention from the moment he planted the seeds in late May. Atlantic giant seeds, the kind that produced competition-worthy specimens if you knew what you were doing and got lucky with weather. Marcus had done everything right, built a custom greenhouse to control the early growing conditions, mixed his soil blend with the precision of a chemist, monitored water and nutrients with religious devotion. By July, he'd selected the most promising vine, removed all other fruit to focus the plant's entire energy into a single pumpkin. By August, that pumpkin had swollen to remarkable size, gaining 15 pounds per day at its peak. By September, it had become the largest specimen he'd ever produced, easily over 1,800 pounds, maybe pushing 2,000. The local newspaper had run a feature about it in early October, complete with photos of Marcus standing beside his monstrous creation. Other farmers stopped by to admire it, their expressions mixing envy with respect. Even Emma had called, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine interest rather than polite obligation. The pumpkin represented vindication, proof that Marcus Brennan still had what it took, despite his age, despite farming alone, despite the whispers around town that maybe it was time for him to sell the land and move into something more manageable. He'd planned to harvest it for the county fair, scheduled for the 3rd weekend of October. Would have been his crowning achievement, the kind of win that gets remembered and repeated in local circles for years afterward. But 3 days before the fair, Marcus noticed something wrong. A soft spot had developed on the pumpkin's underside, not immediately visible but detectable when he pressed gently against the thick skin. At first, he'd hoped it was just minor bottom rot, a common enough problem that could sometimes be managed. But overnight, the spot had spread, and by morning, the entire lower portion felt mushy, unstable. Standing in his barn workshop at dawn, surrounded by tools his grandfather had used and his father had maintained, Marcus faced a decision. Let the pumpkin continue deteriorating and risk losing everything, or cut into it now, salvage whatever seeds he could, and at least preserve the genetics for next season. The choice felt heavier than it should have, weighted with symbolism he didn't want to examine too closely. This pumpkin had been his focus, his purpose, the thing that got him out of bed through another lonely summer. Cutting it open ahead of schedule felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that even his best efforts couldn't overcome the fundamental unpredictability of nature. But farmers didn't have the luxury of sentimentality. You did what the situation required, made hard choices, moved forward. Marcus selected his largest knife, a commercial meat saw with a blade long enough to penetrate deep, and approached the pumpkin where it rested on reinforced sawhorses in the barn's central bay. The first cut should have been straightforward. Pumpkin flesh, even in giants, maintained a certain consistency, dense but yielding, with stringy internal fibers surrounding the seed cavity. Marcus had butchered hundreds of pumpkins over the years, knew exactly how the knife should move, what resistance to expect. But this felt wrong immediately. The blade encountered something that shifted, something with weight and substance that didn't belong. He pulled back, confused, then tried again at a different angle. The sound that came from inside the pumpkin made his blood turn cold. Not the normal settling of vegetable matter, but something that suggested structure, complexity, intention. Marcus's hands started shaking, but he forced himself to continue, widening the cut, peeling back the thick rind to expose what lay beneath the orange skin. What emerged wasn't seeds and stringy flesh. It was plastic, carefully sealed bags arranged with deliberate precision around something central, something that explained why this pumpkin had grown so large, so fast. Why its weight distribution had felt slightly off when he moved it, why the soft spot had developed exactly where someone might have made an access point and imperfectly sealed it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus stumbled backward, the knife clattering to the concrete floor. His mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him, kept insisting there had to be some rational explanation, some farming phenomenon he'd simply never encountered. But 37 years of experience couldn't be argued with. Someone had used his prize pumpkin as a container, had carefully hollowed it out while it grew, created a living safe that would never be questioned or examined too closely, because who would suspect a farmer's competition entry of hiding anything beyond seeds and ambition? His first instinct was to cover it back up, to pretend he'd seen nothing, to let the pumpkin rot and take its secrets back into the earth. But his hands moved before his caution could stop them, pulling out one of the plastic-wrapped bundles, feeling its weight, seeing through the translucent material what could only be tightly bound stacks of currency. Not new bills, but used ones, mixed denominations, the kind of money that couldn't be easily traced or accounted for. Marcus's legs gave out, and he sat hard on the barn floor, still clutching the bundle, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to confront. This barn had been locked all season, secured because of the pumpkin's value, accessible only to him. Which meant whoever had done this either had keys or had done it before the pumpkin got too large to move easily. And there was only one person besides Marcus who'd had unrestricted access to this property, who'd known about his plans to grow a competition giant, who'd helped him set up the greenhouse and select the initial growing site. His father, Harold Brennan, who died suddenly last November from a heart attack while checking fence lines, who'd been acting strangely those final months, making trips to Indianapolis without clear explanation, meeting with people Marcus didn't recognize, deflecting questions with uncharacteristic irritation. Who'd specifically asked Marcus about his plans for the next growing season during their last conversation, had seemed particularly interested in the giant pumpkin project, had even suggested the exact location where Marcus eventually planted. The barn suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Marcus forced himself to stand, to approach the pumpkin again, to systematically remove the remaining bundles. 7 in total, each roughly the same size, each heavy with implications that extended far beyond their monetary value. At the center of the arrangement sat something else entirely, a leather satchel sealed in additional plastic, its contents creating irregular bulges that suggested papers, documents, evidence of something his father had been involved in. Marcus's hands shook so badly he could barely manage the knife as he cut away more of the pumpkin's interior, revealing the full extent of the cavity that had been created. The work was sophisticated, surgical almost, requiring knowledge of plant biology and growth patterns. Someone had understood how to hollow the pumpkin without killing it, how to create space while maintaining the external appearance of health, how to seal access points so the plant could continue developing. His father had been a skilled farmer, but this went beyond normal agricultural expertise. This suggested planning, resources, possibly help from others with specialized knowledge. The leather satchel resisted his attempts to open it, the seal having fused somewhat from months inside the pumpkin's humid environment. When it finally gave way, papers spilled across the barn floor, their edges slightly warped, but their contents still clearly legible. Bank statements, ledgers written in his father's precise hand, photographs of men Marcus didn't recognize, standing beside vehicles loaded with agricultural equipment, maps with properties marked, including several in counties. Marcus knew his father had never farmed. One document stood out from the rest. A letter addressed to Marcus himself, his name written in his father's unmistakable script across a sealed envelope. The date on it was November 3rd of last year, just 5 days before Harold's fatal heart attack. Marcus's hands steadied enough to open it, unfolding pages covered front and back with his father's writing, words that would explain everything and change his understanding of the man who'd raised him. The letter began with an apology, not for what had been done, but for the burden of discovery, for forcing Marcus into a position where he'd have to make choices no son should face about his father's legacy. Harold's words were matter of fact, written with the same practical tone he'd used when teaching Marcus about crop rotation or equipment maintenance, as if confessing to criminal activity required no more emotional weight than explaining how to properly maintain a tractor. According to the letter, Harold had gotten involved with a distribution network 5 years earlier, during a particularly brutal financial period when medical bills from Marcus's mother's final illness had threatened to consume the farm. What started as a simple agreement to allow his barn as occasional storage had evolved into something more complex, more lucrative, and more dangerous. The network moved product through agricultural channels, using farms as waypoints, exploiting the fact that rural properties with large outbuildings rarely attracted scrutiny, that farmers coming and going at odd hours seemed perfectly normal. Harold had tried to exit the arrangement multiple times, but the people he'd gotten involved with didn't accept resignations. So he'd made a different choice, started documenting everything, keeping records, building a case that could bring down the entire operation if it ever needed to come to light. The cash in the pumpkin represented his share of the profits, money he couldn't deposit or spend without raising questions, insurance he'd hoped might buy safe passage out if things went wrong. The documents were his backup plan, leverage to ensure the organization left him alone, proof that could destroy them if they retaliated. The letter concluded with instructions Marcus now held in hands that had gone numb with shock. "If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. Not from my heart, despite what they'll tell you. They've been watching me, and I've been watching them, and eventually one side was always going to act. I've tried to protect you by keeping you ignorant, but ignorance won't save you now. The farm is yours, and so are these choices. The money can disappear, scattered in the fields, fed to the soil like compost. But the documents, Marcus, the documents are power and poison both. They could free you from any suspicion, or they could make you the next target. Choose carefully, destroy this letter regardless, and forgive your father for farming in fields he shouldn't have ploughed." Marcus sat on the cold barn floor as morning light strengthened through the high windows, illuminating dust motes and the catastrophic remains of his prize pumpkin. His competition entry, his crowning achievement, had been nothing but a container for his father's crimes, a living safe that would have rotted and returned its contents to the earth if Marcus hadn't noticed the soft spot, hadn't decided to cut into it early, hadn't accidentally stumbled into a truth that would force him to decide what kind of man he was. The bundles of cash sat in a row before him like accusations. The documents spread across the floor read like indictments of a man Marcus had thought he knew, a father who'd taught him about integrity and hard work while simultaneously running product through their family barn. The letter's final words echoed in his mind, their weight settling into his bones with the same permanence as arthritis. Choose carefully. Outside, the October sun climbed higher over fields his family had worked for 5 generations, over land that held the sweat and sacrifice of ancestors who'd believed farming meant honest labor producing honest crops. Inside this barn, surrounded by tools that had built a legitimate legacy, Marcus held evidence that his father had betrayed everything that legacy represented. The phone in his pocket felt heavy with the choice it represented. Call the sheriff, honor the law, risk everything the Brennan name had built, or feed the money to the fields, burn the documents, protect a dead man's reputation at the cost of his own conscience. The pumpkin's hollowed remains sat on the sawhorses like a grotesque monument to compromised ambition, its orange skin still beautiful on the outside, its interior revealing cavity and conspiracy. Marcus had spent 6 months nurturing this thing, had poured his expertise and hope into growing it, never knowing he was cultivating evidence, tending a crime scene disguised as agricultural achievement. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Just checking in, Dad. Hope you're doing okay this week. I know October is always hard without Mom." The innocence of her message, her complete ignorance of what was happening 60 miles south of her Chicago apartment, somehow made everything worse. She'd left this life behind, escaped the weight of continuing something just because generations before had done it. Now Marcus understood there might have been wisdom in that choice, that maybe some legacies deserved to die rather than be perpetuated through compromise and moral flexibility. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, his back sending sharp reminders of every year he'd spent bent over these fields. The barn's shadows seemed darker suddenly, its familiar space transformed into something threatening. How many nights had his father stood exactly here, accepting deliveries, facilitating distribution, building the case that would eventually sit spread across this concrete floor? How many times had Marcus been sleeping in the house just 100 yards away, completely unaware that his inheritance was being poisoned? The knife still lay where he dropped it, its blade smeared with pumpkin flesh and the residue of shattered illusions. Marcus picked it up, cleaned it methodically, his movements automatic, while his mind worked through scenarios and consequences. Every choice led somewhere dark. Report it, and become the farmer who betrayed his father's memory, who brought shame to the Brennan name. who ensured the local newspaper's next story about him would be considerably different from their recent puff piece about his prize pumpkin. Stay silent and become complicit, carrying knowledge that would corrode him from the inside, wondering if the people his father had been involved with knew about the evidence, if they'd come looking for it eventually. A sound outside the barn froze Marcus mid-motion. An engine, growing closer, turning off the main road onto the long driveway that led to the farm. Not the familiar rumble of a neighbor's truck or the grinding diesel of delivery vehicles. Something else, something that sent instinct screaming before logic could explain why. Marcus moved quickly despite his protesting joints, gathering the bundles, shoving them back into the pumpkin's cavity, covering the opening with the cut section of rind. The documents took longer, his shaking hands making the task difficult, but he managed to stuff them back into the leather satchel and tuck it deep into the hollow interior. By the time the vehicle pulled up outside, Marcus was standing near his workbench, trying to look like a farmer engaged in normal morning tasks, rather than a son who'd just discovered his father's darkest secrets. Through the barn's window, he watched two men emerge from a black SUV with out-of-county plates. They wore casual clothes that somehow looked wrong, too clean for farm work, too deliberate in their rural costuming. Neither smiled as they approached the barn's open door. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the situation his father's letter had warned about. These weren't customers looking to buy pumpkins. They were the answer to what happened when someone kept records on people who valued anonymity above all else. And the massive, partially butchered pumpkin sitting in plain view behind him was about to require an explanation he hadn't had time to prepare. The taller of the two men spoke first, his voice carrying the flat neutrality of someone accustomed to uncomfortable conversations. "Marcus Brennan? I'm Daniel Webb. This is my associate Victor Chen. We're here about your father's estate. Mind if we come in?" Marcus forced his breathing steady, wiped his palms on his work pants, and nodded toward the barn's interior. "Estate's been settled for months. Lawyers handled everything back in December." Webb stepped inside without waiting for explicit permission, his eyes scanning the space with professional thoroughness. Chen followed, positioning himself near the door in a way that seemed casual but blocked the most direct exit. Neither man showed particular interest in the gutted pumpkin yet, but Marcus knew that wouldn't last. "Legal estate, sure," Webb continued, his gaze settling on the various tools and equipment with the assessment of someone cataloging assets. "But your father had business arrangements that extended beyond what probate court handles. Agreements that don't automatically dissolve just because one party passes away." The confirmation of his father's involvement hit harder than Marcus had anticipated, even after reading the letter. Some part of him had hoped the documents were paranoid fabrications, elaborate fictions his father's declining mind had constructed. But these men standing in his barn made it undeniably real. Harold Brennan had been exactly what the letter claimed, and the consequences of his choices had arrived at Marcus's door. "I don't know anything about my father's business," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "He farmed this land same as his father before him, grew corn, soybeans, kept some livestock. That's what I know." Chen finally spoke, his voice softer than Webb's, but somehow more threatening for its gentleness. "Your father was a smart man, Mr. Brennan. Careful. When careful people get nervous, they tend to keep records. Insurance, you understand? And those records have a way of becoming problematic if they fall into wrong hands." Marcus's mind raced through options while his body remained still. The letter in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. The documents hidden in the pumpkin behind him might as well have been screaming their location. Every instinct told him these men already knew something, were testing him, watching for reactions that would confirm suspicions. If he kept records, I never saw them, Marcus said. Man had a heart attack checking fence lines. Doctor said it was quick, probably didn't feel much, nothing suspicious about it. Webb's expression didn't change. We're not suggesting otherwise. Your father's death was unfortunate but natural. We're simply tying up loose ends, making sure everyone understands that certain arrangements died with him. No continuation, no inheritance of obligations. Clean break. The emphasis on those final words carried unmistakable implication. They were offering him an out, a way to walk away from whatever his father had been involved in, provided Marcus could assure them the documentation Harold had compiled wouldn't surface. It was almost generous if you ignored the underlying threat of what would happen if that assurance couldn't be given. Then we're on the same page, Marcus said. Whatever Dad was doing, it died with him. I'm just trying to keep this farm running. Chen's attention finally shifted to the destroyed pumpkin, his head tilting slightly as he took in the surgical precision of the cuts, the hollowed interior visible even from his position near the door. That's quite a specimen. We read about it in the county paper. Supposed to win the fair this weekend. Bottom rot, Marcus replied, grateful his voice didn't shake. Started yesterday. Had to cut it open, see if I could salvage seeds for next year. Sometimes you lose them, even when you do everything right. Webb moved closer to the pumpkin, circling it slowly, his trained eyes noting details Marcus couldn't hide. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, for someone simply investigating rot. The interior cavity showed removal patterns, places where something had clearly been extracted. A man like Webb would recognize excavation when he saw it. Must be disappointing, Webb said, putting in all that work for nothing. That's farming. Nature doesn't care about your plans. The three men stood in tense tableau, barn dust drifting through morning light that illuminated nothing good. Marcus calculated distances, considered whether he could reach the workbench where other tools offered more defensive options than conversation. But Chen's positioning remained strategic, and Webb moved with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with confrontation. Here's the thing, Webb continued, his hand resting on the pumpkin's orange skin. Your father was part of something larger than himself, network of good people, farmers mostly, helping each other through difficult times. Nothing violent, nothing that hurt anybody. Just moving goods through agricultural channels, utilizing infrastructure that was already in place. Smart, efficient, profitable for everyone involved. Marcus said nothing, recognizing the pitch for what it was. They were trying to recruit him, bring him into the fold as Harold's replacement. The farm's location, its established isolation, the barn's capacity, all made it valuable real estate for their purposes. And a son continuing his father's work would draw no suspicion, would seem like natural succession rather than criminal expansion. Problem is, Chen added, when people leave this kind of arrangement, it creates complications. Your father understood that. Which is why we're confused about some things he said before he died. References to insurance, to protection, to documents that could cause trouble if they surfaced. There it was, the real reason for their visit. They weren't here to recruit or threaten. They were here because Harold had made them afraid, had created uncertainty about what evidence existed and where it might be hidden. The old man had played his final card well, ensuring that even in death he maintained leverage over people who didn't tolerate loose ends. Marcus chose his words carefully, walking a razor's edge between admission and denial. My father had a heart condition. Medication made him paranoid sometimes. He'd say things that didn't make sense, worry about threats that didn't exist. His doctor could have told you that if you'd asked before he died." "We did ask," Webb said quietly. "Doctor confirmed the medication, the paranoia, the declining mental clarity. But your father was also smart enough to hide things where they wouldn't be easily found. Smart enough to create contingencies that might trigger even after his death." The implication was clear. They'd searched, probably multiple times, had gone through Harold's possessions, his records, maybe even this barn while Marcus was in town or sleeping. But they hadn't found what they were looking for, which meant either the documents didn't exist or they were hidden somewhere these professionals couldn't access. Somewhere like inside a giant pumpkin that wouldn't be cut open until right before the county fair, that would be watched and guarded because of its competition value, that would seem like the last place anyone would hide evidence because nobody hollows out a living plant to create a safe, except someone had. And that someone had been brilliant or desperate enough to understand that the best hiding places aren't secure vaults, but organic matter that would naturally decompose if never harvested, that would return secrets to the soil if the right person never came to collect them. Marcus felt the weight of his father's planning, the pucked, intricate layers of protection Harold had constructed. The pumpkin hadn't been just a hiding place. It had been a test, a way to ensure only Marcus would find the evidence, only after enough time had passed for Harold's death to be fully accepted as natural. The soft spot that had developed wasn't rot, but deliberate deterioration, something Harold had engineered to ensure the pumpkin would need to be opened before the fair, before it could be transported where these men might have access to it. "You look nervous, Mr. Brennan," Chen observed, his soft voice cutting through Marcus's racing thoughts. "Understandable situation. Two strangers showing up asking questions about your dead father. But we're not here to cause problems. We just need to know if anything exists that could complicate matters. If it does, we can work together to ensure it's handled appropriately. If it doesn't, we all walk away. Forget this conversation ever happened." The offer was poisoned honey. Sweet words wrapped around a threat that didn't need to be spoken explicitly. Work together meant surrender whatever Harold had hidden. Walk away meant only if Marcus could convince them nothing existed to be found. And if he couldn't provide that certainty, well, the unspoken consequences hung in the barn's dusty air like coming weather. Marcus made a decision that felt less like choice than inevitability, the only path forward through terrain where every step held danger. "You want to search the place? Go ahead. Farmhouse, outbuildings, fields, wherever. I've got nothing to hide because there's nothing hidden. Dad was sick, paranoid, and whatever he told you was delusion talking." Webb exchanged a glance with Chen, some silent communication passing between them. "We've already searched," Webb admitted. "Several times, actually, very thoroughly. Which brings us back to this barn, this pumpkin, and the interesting timing of you cutting it open right before we arrived." Marcus's blood went cold. They'd been watching, waiting, possibly had surveillance on the property. The soft spot hadn't been Harold's engineering, but actual rot, and Marcus's decision to harvest early had inadvertently moved up a timeline that would have played out differently if he'd waited for the fair. These men had been patient, monitoring, ready to intercept the moment the pumpkin's contents became accessible. "You're welcome to look inside," Marcus said, gambling everything on a desperate bluff. "Seeds and rotten flesh, same as any pumpkin. You want to sift through it, be my guest. But I'm telling you there's nothing here." He watched Webb's face carefully, looking for tells that might indicate whether they believed him, whether they'd seen him frantically hiding the contents before they entered, whether this entire conversation was theater before they simply took what they wanted by force. The moment stretched thin and brittle, ready to shatter in whatever direction pressure applied. Then Webb stepped back, from the pumpkin, his posture relaxing incrementally. "That won't be necessary. We believe you, Mr. Brennan. Your father was a paranoid old man whose medication played tricks on him. Nothing more complicated than that." But Chen didn't relax, his eyes staying locked on Marcus with intensity that suggested he wasn't convinced, that he saw cracks in the performance and was simply choosing not to push. "Yet, we'll be in touch," Chen said. "Just to check in periodically, make sure you're doing okay. Running a farm alone can be hard. Good to have friends who understand the challenges." It wasn't friendship they were offering, but surveillance, a permanent presence hovering at the edge of Marcus's life, waiting for him to slip, to reveal what they suspected he was hiding. The thought of years spent looking over his shoulder, wondering when they'd return, when patience would give way to more direct methods, settled into Marcus's chest like a stone. They left without further conversation, their SUV kicking up dust as it retreated down the long driveway. Marcus remained motionless until the sound of their engine faded completely, until nothing remained but wind through bare trees and the distant call of crows in fields waiting for winter. Only then did he approach the pumpkin, pulling away the hastily replaced section of rind, extracting the bundles and documents he'd hidden with hands that shook so badly he could barely maintain his grip. The letter from his father seemed heavier now, its words weighted with understanding of exactly this kind of moment, when choices made in desperation would determine whether Harold's gambit had been brilliant protection or fatal miscalculation. Marcus spread the documents across his workbench, studying them with new urgency. Bank statements showing irregular deposits to Harold's account, always just under the reporting threshold that would trigger automatic investigation. Ledgers detailing shipments through the barn, dates and amounts that corresponded with nights. Marcus now remembered his father being inexplicably busy, claiming equipment repairs or late-season fieldwork. Photographs that showed his father alongside men Marcus didn't recognize, their body language suggesting familiarity and shared purpose. But most damning were the maps. Properties throughout 3 counties marked with codes that Harold's notes explained. Distribution points, storage facilities, routes that moved product from source to destination using agricultural cover that rarely attracted attention. The network Webb had mentioned wasn't small-time operation, but sophisticated enterprise that probably moved millions of dollars in goods annually. And buried within this documentation was something neither Webb nor Chen could know about, something that would terrify them if they understood its existence. Harold hadn't just kept records of his own involvement. He documented the entire network, including people far up the chain, individuals whose names would be recognized beyond rural Indiana, whose positions made their participation in criminal enterprise particularly explosive. Harold had built not just insurance but a nuclear option, evidence that could bring down powerful people along with the farmers and drivers who moved their product. No wonder they'd been patient, willing to write off one old man's death as natural rather than risk the attention that violence would bring. As long as the documents stayed hidden, they were a manageable threat. But if they surfaced, if Marcus took them to authorities, the consequences would cascade upward until very important people found their carefully constructed lives demolished. Marcus understood now why his father had hidden everything inside a giant pumpkin rather than a traditional safe or buried container. If Harold had died and Marcus had simply found a safe, he might have opened it carelessly, without preparation or protection. But a pumpkin required specific conditions for discovery. It would only be cut open when ready for harvest. When Marcus had already invested 6 months of careful attention, when the farming season had progressed to the point where Marcus would be thinking about next year's crop rather than past year's mysteries. Harold had given his son time, separation from the immediate aftermath of death, space to process grief before confronting truth. And he'd ensured that the discovery would happen in the barn, on family land, surrounded by tools and earth that connected Marcus to every Brennan who'd farmed this ground. The setting itself was message, reminder that some things mattered more than fear or self-preservation. But Harold had also condemned his son to impossible choice. Keep the documents and live under permanent threat from people who would never stop watching, never believe Marcus had destroyed evidence they knew existed. Or turn everything over to authorities and watch the Brennan name become synonymous with crime and betrayal, ensure that 5 generations of honest farming would be reduced to footnote in stories about rural drug networks. Marcus's phone buzzed again, Emma's name appearing on the screen with another text. "Dad, just want to make sure you're okay. You've been quiet lately. Want me to come down this weekend?" The innocence of her concern, the daughter checking on her aging father, felt like accusation. Emma had escaped this place, built a life untethered from soil and secrets and the crushing weight of maintaining something just because ancestors had bled for it. She'd chosen freedom over legacy, and Marcus had judged her for it, had felt abandoned by her refusal to value what he valued. Now he wondered if she'd simply been smarter, if her departure had been wisdom rather than betrayal. Maybe some legacies deserved to die, should be allowed to fade rather than perpetuated through compromise that corroded everything it touched. Maybe the best thing Marcus could do was let the farm go, scatter his father's ashes and his father's sins together, start over somewhere. Nobody knew the Brennan name or expected him to carry forward traditions built on increasingly questionable foundations. But even as he considered walking away, Marcus's hands were gathering the documents, his mind was already planning next steps. His farmer's instinct to protect what was his was overriding logical self-preservation. This was his land, his legacy, his choice. Not Webb's, not Chen's, not even Harold's anymore. The old man had made his decisions and paid for them with a heart that gave out under stress no medication could relieve. Now Marcus had to decide what price he was willing to pay, what he was willing to sacrifice to keep ground his family had held for 137 years. Outside, October wind carried the smell of harvest, of dying things returning to earth, of cycles that continued regardless of human drama. The fields didn't care about crime or consequence. They just waited for spring, for hands to work them, for seeds to be planted and tended and reaped. Patient and indifferent and eternal in ways human concerns could never match. Marcus carefully repackaged the documents, sealing them in fresh plastic, hiding them in a place these men would never think to look because it violated every instinct about security and protection. He scattered the money in the manure pile behind the barn, mixing it with organic matter that would gradually compost it into unrecognizable pulp, returning it to the earth, like Harold had suggested. The cash didn't matter. It was the evidence that held power, that represented both weapon and vulnerability. Then he dragged what remained of the pumpkin out to the compost heap, breaking it down into pieces that would decompose rapidly, eliminating any trace of the cavity that had been carved into its interior. By next spring, it would be nothing but rich soil, ready to nurture new growth, indistinguishable from every other organic thing that had died and transformed on this land. The barn felt emptier when he returned to it, swept clean of secrets, but not of their lingering weight. Marcus stood at the workbench, where his grandfather had shaped wood, and his father had documented crimes, where he now faced choices that would define what the Brennan name meant going forward. Honor or survival, truth or safety, legacy or freedom. The old binary oppositions that had always defined farming life, where weather forced decisions and seasons didn't negotiate. His phone rang, Emma's name appearing, her voice bright and concerned when he answered. "Dad? You okay?" Your texts have been weird lately. Marcus looked out the barn window at fields turning golden in afternoon light, at land that held every Brennan who'd ever lived here. Their sweat and sacrifice and secrets all feeding the same soil. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Just dealing with some things your grandfather left behind. Nothing for you to worry about. You sure? I can come down, take a few days off work. We could go through his stuff together if you need help." "No," Marcus said quickly. Too quickly. Then moderated his tone. "I mean, thank you, but I've got it handled. You focus on your life up there. I'll call if I need anything." After they hung up, Marcus remained at the window, watching shadows lengthen across land his family had held through wars and depression and every challenge that rural America could throw at farmers who refused to quit. Emma had been right to leave, right to build something separate from this weight. And he'd been right to stay, right to understand that some things mattered more than ease or safety. The question was whether he had the strength to do what his father couldn't, to break the cycle Harold had gotten caught in, to find a way forward that honored legitimate legacy while rejecting the corruption that had infected it. Whether he could be the kind of man this land deserved rather than the kind circumstances were forcing him to become. Marcus closed the barn doors as the sun touched the horizon, locking mechanisms that would keep nothing out if Webb and Chen decided patience had expired. But the gesture felt important anyway, ritual marking of transition from one day to the next, from one version of himself to whatever came after. Tomorrow he'd have to decide about the documents, about the evidence that could destroy or protect depending on how he wielded it. Tonight, he'd sit with the weight, let it settle into his bones the way grief had, the way his father's absence had, the way every hard truth eventually did for people who worked ground that never lied about what it cost to remain. The sheriff's cruiser appeared 3 days later, not with sirens but with the slow deliberation of someone who'd received information worth investigating but wasn't yet ready to make it official. Marcus watched from the farmhouse porch as Sheriff Tom Castellano emerged, a man he'd known since high school, whose family had farmed 2 counties over until the bank took their land in the 90s. Tom understood what it meant to lose ground your family had bled for, which made what Marcus was about to do either easier or infinitely harder, depending on how the conversation went. "Marcus," Tom said, climbing the porch steps with the careful movement of someone whose knees had given out years ago but refused to admit weakness. "Got a call from state police. Said some people have been asking around about your father, about this property. Wanted to know if everything was all right out here." Marcus gestured to the chairs his grandfather had built, wood worn smooth by generations of Brennans, watching sunset over their fields. "Everything's complicated, Tom. But I suppose it's time somebody knew just how complicated." They sat as afternoon light turned the eastern fields to copper, and Marcus told the story his father had written, supplemented with what he'd discovered, what Webb and Chen had confirmed through their presence and their threats. He didn't show Tom the documents yet, just painted the picture in words that came harder than he'd anticipated, each sentence feeling like betrayal of a dead man who'd made terrible choices for reasons Marcus was only beginning to understand. Tom listened without interrupting, his weathered face revealing nothing until Marcus finished. Then the sheriff was quiet for long enough that a hawk circled overhead 3 times, hunting voles in the dying grass. "Your father was a good man," Tom finally said. "Helped my family when the bank came calling. Offered to co-sign a loan, even though he barely knew us. Just knew what it meant to watch your legacy get auctioned off piece by piece. That doesn't excuse what he did." "No," Tom agreed. "But it explains why he might have said yes when desperate people offered money he needed to keep this place running. Medical bills from your mother's illness damn near bankrupted him, Marcus. I saw the strain on his face every time I ran into him those last years. Man was drowning, and somebody threw him a rope without mentioning it was attached to an anchor. Marcus had known about the medical debt, had even offered to help when his own savings allowed, but his father had refused with the stubborn pride that defined men who measured worth by self-sufficiency. Now that pride seemed less like strength and more like the fatal flaw in Greek tragedies Emma used to read about, the character defect that transforms heroes into cautionary tales. He kept records, Marcus said, everything, names, dates, routes, financial transfers. Enough to bring down people who make Webb and Chen look like errand boys. Tom's expression shifted, professional calculation replacing personal sympathy. That's federal territory. People involved at that level, they don't just have lawyers, they have entire systems built to protect them. You go after them, you better be prepared for what comes back at you. And if I don't, if I just let it go, pretend I never found anything, then you live with knowing, and you hope those men who visited your barn believe you destroyed whatever your father hid. But Marcus, people like that, they don't really believe anything. They just wait, and eventually they'll decide the risk of you having evidence outweighs the risk of eliminating that possibility permanently. The truth of it settled like November frost, cold and inevitable. Marcus had known it already, had felt it in Chen's eyes and Webb's careful words. They'd given him temporary reprieve, but reprieve wasn't resolution. They'd be back, or others like them would be. And next time, the conversation might not stay conversational. There's a third option, Tom said, his voice dropping lower, even though they were alone with only the wind to overhear. You give me the documents. Let me take them to people I trust at the state level. We build a case quietly, move carefully, protect your name as much as possible. Your father was coerced, pushed into something by circumstances and predatory people. That's the story we tell, and it's true enough. You're the son who discovered his father's burden and did the right thing. Some mudsticks, sure, but you're not painted as accomplice or profiteer. Marcus considered the offer, the political calculus of sacrifice and redemption Tom was proposing. It was elegant in its way, a path that honored obligation to law while minimizing damage to the Brennan name. But it required trust Marcus wasn't certain he possessed anymore, faith that systems designed to protect would actually function as advertised rather than grinding him up in machinery built to serve different masters. I need to think about it, Marcus said. Can you give me a week? Tom stood, his knees cracking audibly. I can give you 3 days. After that, if those men come back and something happens, it becomes official investigation with or without your cooperation. Better to control the narrative while you still can. After the sheriff left, Marcus walked the property line his great-grandfather had established, following fence posts that leaned at angles time and weather had dictated. The land looked different now, not in any physical way but in emotional coloring, as if discovering his father's secrets had changed the soil's very composition. Every field Harold had planted became suspect, every structure he'd maintained potentially complicit in activities that violated everything farming was supposed to represent. But the land itself remained innocent. Soil didn't care about human corruption. It just waited for seeds, for rain, for hands willing to work it according to patterns older than law or morality. The earth had absorbed his family's sweat and would someday absorb their bones with the same indifference, transforming everything back into elements that would feed whatever came next. Marcus found himself at the family cemetery, a small fenced plot on the property's highest point where Brennans had been buried since 1887, when the first infant death made formal arrangements necessary. His mother's stone was newest, polished granite that hadn't yet weathered to match its neighbors. His father's plot beside hers remained unmarked, Harold's ashes scattered across the eastern fields, according to wishes he'd specified, wanting to literally become part of the land he'd worked. Now, Marcus understood that choice differently. His father hadn't wanted a stone that people could visit, a permanent marker that would invite questions and judgment. Better to disappear into the soil, to be ploughed under and forgotten, except in family memory that could be selective about what it preserved. Emma called that evening, her timing either coincidental or evidence of the intuition she'd always possessed about when Marcus needed connection. "You sound strange," she said after minimal pleasantries. "What's going on down there?" Marcus almost told her. Everything, the words forming and dying on his tongue multiple times. But what would it accomplish, except transferring burden she'd deliberately escaped? Emma had built a life separate from this land's weight, had created identity not defined by soil and legacy and generational obligation. Pulling her back into Brennan drama would be cruel gift at best, the kind of inheritance nobody wanted. "Just tired," he said. "Harvest season always takes it out of me. You know you can sell, right? Move closer to me, get a place where you're not working yourself to death for diminishing returns." "The farm market isn't getting better, Dad. Small operations like yours, they're going extinct." She wasn't wrong. Marcus had seen the statistics, understood the economics, pushing agriculture toward consolidation that favored corporate entities over family farms. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different territories entirely, separated by canyons of identity and purpose that numbers couldn't bridge. "I'll think about it," he said, the same deflection he'd given Tom, buying time he probably didn't have for decisions that maybe didn't have right answers. After they hung up, Marcus retrieved the documents from their hiding place in the machine shop, spread them across the kitchen table his great-grandmother had served meals on, and read through everything again with the kind of attention he normally reserved for seed catalogues and weather forecasts. His father's handwriting filled margins with observations and dates, creating narrative of gradual entrapment that began with single favor and ended with comprehensive criminal involvement. But embedded within the documentation was something Marcus had initially missed, a pattern that only revealed itself through multiple readings. Harold hadn't just kept records. He'd been systematically undermining the operation, making small changes that reduced efficiency, introducing errors that caused shipments to be delayed or rerouted, creating friction that cost the network money and reliability. It was subtle sabotage, the kind that could be dismissed as aging farmers' declining competence, but Marcus recognized his father's precision in every calculated mistake. Harold had been fighting back, in the only way available to someone too deep to escape, but too principled to simply participate. He'd transformed himself into malicious compliance, following instructions while ensuring they failed in ways that couldn't be directly attributed to intentional interference. And he'd documented his sabotage alongside their crimes, building a record that would show he'd been trying to damage them from within, even as circumstances forced his cooperation. The revelation shifted something in Marcus's understanding. His father hadn't been weak collaborator, but embedded resistance, a man who'd made one terrible compromise and spent the remaining years of his life trying to mitigate damage while protecting his family from consequences. The pumpkin wasn't just hiding place but final act of defiance, ensuring that even in death, Harold would continue causing problems for people who'd exploited his desperation. Marcus felt tears he hadn't known were building, grief mixed with pride and anger at choices that should never have been necessary. His father had died carrying weight that should have been shared, protecting his son through isolation that must have been crushing loneliness. All those nights, Harold had been in the barn, supposedly maintaining equipment. He'd been making notes, taking photographs, building a case while pretending to facilitate crimes. Living double life that required constant vigilance and resulted in heart that couldn't sustain the stress. The next morning, Marcus drove to Oak Ridge Cemetery, where his mother was buried, parked under trees shedding the last of their leaves, and sat on the bench, facing her stone. He talked to her the way he used to before she got too sick for real conversation, explaining what their husband had done, what he'd been trying to protect them from, what choices their son now faced. "He should have told us," Marcus said to Granite, that absorbed his words without judgment. "We could have helped him carry it. That's what family does, right? Share the weight so nobody breaks under it alone." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew why Harold hadn't shared the burden. Because telling would have made them accessories or targets, would have forced them into choosing between loyalty and law, between protecting him and protecting themselves. Harold had kept them ignorant as final gift, ensuring that whatever happened, his wife and son could truthfully claim innocence. Marcus stayed until afternoon. Shadows stretched long across the graves, until he'd processed grief that had been waiting 3 years for its real target, until he understood that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what his father had done, but accepting the humanity behind impossible choices. On the drive back to the farm, Marcus made his decision. Not the one Tom had proposed, not the one Webb and Chen would have preferred, but something that honored his father's sabotage while protecting what remained of the Brennan name. He would give Tom the documents, but only after making copies and establishing Dead Man's switch protocol with lawyer he trusted. If anything happened to Marcus, everything would be released publicly, ensuring that silencing him would accomplish nothing except guaranteeing exposure. It was leverage, the same kind Harold had tried to create, insurance that made him more valuable alive than dead. Whether it would work or simply delay inevitable was unknowable, but it was the best option available in circumstances where perfect solutions didn't exist. Tom arrived, exactly 3 days after their first conversation, his cruiser kicking up dust that hung in cold November air. Marcus met him at the barn with the documents sealed in waterproof container, along with written statement explaining discovery and his father's apparent attempts at internal resistance. "You're doing the right thing," Tom said, accepting the container with the careful handling of someone who understood he was holding explosive material. "Maybe," Marcus replied. "Or maybe I'm just choosing which way to fall. Time will tell." The investigation that followed was conducted with discretion Tom had promised, state authorities moving carefully to verify Harold's documentation before expanding their scope. Marcus was interviewed multiple times, his story consistent because it was true, his cooperation noted in official reports that would matter if charges ever touched close to him. Webb and Chen disappeared before warrants could be issued, their names appearing on lists that federal agencies would pursue with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on political priorities. But the people above them, the ones whose involvement Harold had documented most thoroughly, those individuals started experiencing the kind of scrutiny that made comfortable lives uncomfortable, that transformed secure positions into liabilities, requiring expensive legal defense. Through winter and into early spring, Marcus worked the farm with renewed understanding of why it mattered. Not because Brennans had always farmed this ground, not because legacy demanded continuation, but because the land itself represented honest labor in a world where honesty was increasingly rare. Every seed planted was assertion that some things couldn't be corrupted, that soil and sun and rain operated according to principles no human compromise could alter. Emma visited in March, ostensibly for spring break from the consulting project she was managing, but Marcus suspected Tom had contacted her. explained enough that she understood her father needed support even if he wouldn't ask for it. They worked together in the greenhouse, starting seeds for the new season, her city hands remembering rhythms she'd learned as child. "You could have told me," she said while filling seed trays with soil mix Marcus had prepared according to his grandmother's recipe. "About Grandpa, about all of it. I wouldn't have judged you. Wasn't judgment I was worried about. Was pulling you back into something you'd worked hard to escape." Emma paused, her hands still in the dark earth. "I didn't escape, Dad. I just chose different ground. But that doesn't mean I stopped caring about this place. About you. About what it costs to keep land that remembers 5 generations. They planted corn that spring using conventional methods, no giant pumpkins, no competition ambitions, just honest crop for honest purpose. The fields responded the way they always had, indifferent to human drama, concerned only with moisture and nutrients and sun. By June, the corn stood knee-high. By July, it towered overhead. And by August, it was ready for harvest that would feed cattle and pay bills and continue cycle that predated every Brennan who'd ever worked this ground. On the anniversary of cutting into the pumpkin, Marcus stood in the barn at dawn, remembering the sound of the blade sinking through flesh that shouldn't have been hollow. The moment of discovery that had changed everything. The barn held different weight now, shadows less threatening, space reclaimed from secrets that had been exorcised through sunlight and official documentation. He'd received word the previous week that charges were being filed against 7 individuals in the distribution network, including 2 whose names would be recognized nationally. Harold's documentation had proven comprehensive and credible, his years of careful record-keeping creating case that prosecutors believed they could win. The Brennan name appeared in reports as victim of circumstance rather than willing participant. Harold portrayed as father who'd made bad choice under duress and spent remaining years trying to make it right. It wasn't complete redemption, but it was enough. The farm remained in Marcus's hands, untainted by asset forfeiture or criminal proceeds allegations. His father's reputation had taken damage, but not been destroyed. And Marcus himself had emerged as honest man who'd done difficult right thing when easier wrong options were available. Emma had stayed through planting season, taking remote work assignments that let her remain on the farm longer than either had initially planned. They didn't discuss the future explicitly, but her presence felt less like visit and more like reconnaissance, testing whether she could imagine herself here again, whether the life she'd rejected at 20 might look different at 35. "The land never changes," Marcus told her one evening as they watched sunset paint the fields colors that only existed at that exact time of day. "But what we bring to it, that changes everything. Grandpa brought desperation, and it consumed him. I brought obligation, and almost let it do the same. Maybe you bring something different. Some way of being here that doesn't require sacrifice of everything else." She didn't answer immediately, her silence the kind that meant real consideration rather than polite deflection. "Maybe," she finally said. "Or maybe I just needed to understand that leaving wasn't betrayal. That you can honor legacy without being imprisoned by it." Marcus nodded, understanding that some truths took decades to learn, that the land taught patience above all other virtues. Seeds planted in spring weren't harvested until fall. Decisions made in youth weren't understood until age provided perspective. And legacies built over generations couldn't be judged by single season's yield. The giant pumpkin that had held his father's secrets had returned to soil, its molecules redistributed through compost that would feed next season's growth. But the seeds Marcus had salvaged before destroying the evidence, those remained viable, stored in the machine shop in jar, labeled with careful notation about genetics and growing conditions. Someday, maybe next year or maybe never, he might plant them again, might try to grow legitimate competition entry that honored the craft without carrying the weight. Or maybe he'd give them to Emma, let her decide what to do with legacy that could be both blessing and burden, depending on how you approached it. Some choices didn't need to be made immediately. Some seeds could wait for right season, right conditions, right person to understand what they represented. The farm would be here regardless, patient as only land can be, ready to receive whatever next generation chose to plant, willing to yield whatever care and attention and honest labor could produce. That was the real legacy, not names on deeds or trophies from county fairs, but continuity of purpose that transformed human effort into sustenance that fed bodies and souls both. Marcus locked the barn as full darkness settled, the same ritual his father had performed and his grandfather before him, marking transition from day's work to evening's rest. Tomorrow he'd rise with the sun and begin again, because that's what farmers did, what land required, what legacy actually meant when stripped of romance and reduced to essential truth. The soil would be waiting, indifferent and eternal, ready to grow whatever he planted, to absorb whatever he gave it, to return in harvest what he'd invested in faith. Some things couldn't be corrupted or compromised, couldn't be hidden or stolen or destroyed. The land endured, patient witness to every human drama, silently offering the same bargain it had always offered: work me with honest hands, and I will feed you with honest yield. Marcus accepted that bargain again, as his father had, as every Brennan before him had, as Emma might someday choose to do. The pumpkin's secret had been revealed, its contents exposed to light that would either cleanse or condemn, depending on perspective. But the earth beneath it all remained unchanged, waiting for spring, for seeds, for hands willing to plant hope in dark soil and trust that light would follow. 2 years passed with the quiet insistence of seasons that care nothing for human timelines. The farm absorbed the revelations the way soil absorbs rain, letting them seep deep before showing any visible change. Marcus worked the land with hands that had learned a different kind of strength, not the brute force of youth, but the persistent endurance of someone who understood that some battles are won through simple refusal to quit. The criminal trials proceeded through legal machinery that ground slowly but thoroughly. 3 men were sentenced to federal prison. 4 others accepted plea agreements that would keep them confined through what remained of their productive years. The network Harold had documented was dismantled piece by methodical piece, its infrastructure scattered, its participants either imprisoned or disappeared into whatever lives people build after everything collapses. Marcus testified twice, his words careful and truthful, painting his father as man caught between impossible choices who'd chosen resistance in the only way available to him. The prosecutors used that narrative effectively, transforming Harold Brennan from criminal participant into cautionary tale about how desperation makes victims of honest people. It wasn't complete truth, but it was true enough. And in courtrooms where narrative mattered as much as evidence, it served the purpose both justice and mercy required. The farm's reputation weathered the association better than Marcus had feared. Rural communities understood complexity in ways urban populations often didn't, recognized that good people sometimes made bad choices when circumstances left no good options available. Neighbors who'd known Harold spoke up at town meetings and in coffee shops, sharing stories of his generosity and integrity that predated his involvement with people who'd exploited those very qualities. Emma returned that second spring not as visitor but as partner, her Chicago apartment sublet indefinitely while she tested whether the life she'd rejected could accommodate the person she'd become. She brought skills the farm had never possessed, business acumen and digital literacy that opened markets beyond local grain elevators and farmers' markets. Within 6 months, she'd established online presence for the farm, selling specialty crops to restaurants and consumers who valued knowing exactly where their food originated and who'd grown it. "It's different than I remembered," she said one evening as they walked fields her grandfather had ploughed. "I thought coming back would feel like regression, like admitting I'd failed at the life I built. But it's not that. It's addition, not subtraction. Everything I learned out there makes me better at this." Marcus watched her examine soil moisture with the same analytical attention she'd once applied to corporate strategy, saw how she'd integrated rather than abandoned her education. "Your grandfather would have liked seeing you here," he said, "not because you came back, but because you came back on your own terms, bringing something new instead of just repeating what was." They planted diverse crops that season, moving away from commodity corn and soybeans toward vegetables and herbs that required more labor, but returned better margins. Emma researched heirloom varieties and collaborated with seed libraries, prioritizing genetics that had been maintained by farmers rather than engineered by corporations. It was conscious choice to farm the way earlier Brennans had, before agriculture became industrialized, when diversity was protection rather than inefficiency. The barn, where Marcus had discovered his father's secrets, became workshop for value-added products. Emma's domain, where she transformed raw ingredients into jarred goods that sold for prices that made traditional farming look like charity work. She hired 2 local women whose families had lost their own farms to economic pressures, creating employment that kept knowledge and skill in the community rather than losing it to urban migration. Marcus found himself working less but accomplishing more, his role shifting from solitary farmer to collaborative partner in enterprise that resembled farming but incorporated dimensions Harold's generation would have struggled to imagine. It was evolution, adaptation to changed circumstances using principles that remained constant beneath surface modifications. Tom Castellano stopped by periodically, his visits social rather than official now that legal proceedings had concluded. He'd retired from the sheriff's department but couldn't quite let go of the instinct to check on people he'd sworn to protect. "Property looks different," he observed during one visit, surveying the greenhouse additions and improved infrastructure Emma's investment had funded. "Alive in ways it hasn't been for years." "That's Emma's doing," Marcus said. "Turns out leaving and coming back gives you perspective staying never could. She sees possibilities I'd stopped imagining." Tom nodded, understanding what wasn't being said explicitly. "Your father would be proud, not just of keeping the land, but of transforming it into something sustainable for next generation. That was always his real fear, that the weight of maintaining tradition would crush rather than elevate." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd witnessed each other's struggles and emerged with respect, earned through shared hardship. "You ever regret it?" Tom finally asked. "Turning in those documents, starting all that legal chaos?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Every day for the first year, then gradually less. Now mostly I regret that Dad felt he couldn't trust anyone enough to share the burden sooner. But the documents, the testimony, bringing down that network? No. Some things matter more than comfort or convenience." He understood that, even if it killed him. The maple grove where Harold's ashes had been scattered showed new growth that spring, saplings emerging from seeds that had waited years for the right conditions. Marcus and Emma planted more deliberately, creating memorial grove that would mark their father's complicated legacy with living wood that would outlast any stone monument. Each tree carried a small marker with Harold's name and the years he'd worked this ground, acknowledgement that flawed men could still contribute something worth remembering. On the anniversary of Harold's death, they held small gathering under those young trees, inviting people who'd known him in his better years before desperation had compromised his judgment. Stories were shared, some humorous, some poignant, all contributing to mosaic portrait of man who'd been more than his worst decisions. Marcus had worried the event would feel false, forced celebration of someone whose actions had caused real harm. But listening to neighbors recall Harold's kindness and generosity, watching Emma laugh at anecdotes from her grandfather's younger years, he understood that memory didn't require perfection, only honesty about complexity. He taught me to read soil. One old farmer said, his voice cracking with age and emotion, not just test it chemically, but understand what it was telling you through color and texture and smell. Said soil was like people, complicated and contradictory, but honest if you paid attention. I've carried that lesson 50 years now. Marcus filed the comment away. Recognition that his father's legitimate knowledge had touched lives in ways that would persist long after criminal associations were forgotten. Legacy wasn't singular thing, but accumulation of impacts, some damaging and some nurturing, all combining to create effect that couldn't be reduced to simple judgment. The legal settlements provided modest financial compensation to the Brennan estate, funds Marcus and Emma invested in conservation easements that would protect the farm from future development pressure. It felt appropriate somehow, using money derived from his father's entanglement to ensure the land he tried to protect would remain agricultural in perpetuity. Harold had made his choices trying to save the farm. Now the farm would be saved partially through consequences of those choices. By the third autumn, after the pumpkins' revelation, the farm had achieved stability Marcus hadn't experienced since before his mother's illness. Debt was manageable. Revenue exceeded expenses with enough margin to invest in improvements, and Emma's presence meant he wasn't carrying weight alone. They'd hired a young man from town whose family had given up farming, teaching him methods that blended traditional wisdom with contemporary sustainability practices, creating a succession plan that didn't depend on biological inheritance. "You think about what happens after us?" Emma asked one evening as they processed the day's harvest in the barn that had witnessed so much drama. "Whether this model we're building can survive another transition?" Marcus considered the question while sorting vegetables into distribution boxes. "I think we're creating something more resilient than what came before. Not dependent on single families sacrificing everything to maintain tradition, but community of people who value what land represents and are willing to work collectively to preserve it. That's legacy worth building." She smiled, her hands steady in their work. No longer the uncertain city transplant, but confident farmer who'd found her place through choosing it rather than inheriting it. Grandpa would have liked that answer. He always said farming was community endeavor that got corrupted into isolated competition. Maybe we're just returning to older truth. The giant pumpkin seeds Marcus had saved remained in their jar, viable but unplanted, reminder of what had been hidden and revealed. He'd considered planting them multiple times, but always decided against it, recognizing that some chapters needed to close completely before new ones could begin properly. Perhaps someday Emma's children, or the young man they'd hired, would plant Atlantic giant seeds and grow competition-worthy specimens that carried only legitimate pride, untainted by association with secrets and compromise. Winter brought unexpected visitor. Chen appearing at the farm without Webb, his manner subdued rather than threatening. "I wanted to apologize," he said simply, standing in Marcus's kitchen like ordinary guest rather than person who'd once represented danger. For the pressure, the implicit threats, the way we approached you. I was doing a job, but that doesn't excuse making you afraid in your own home. Marcus studied the man carefully, looking for deception or ulterior motive, finding only what appeared to be genuine regret. Why now? Why come back after 3 years? Because I got out, took plea agreement, cooperated with prosecutors, and now I'm rebuilding life without that weight. Part of that is acknowledging harm I caused, trying to make what amends are possible. I can't undo what happened to your father, can't return years he spent trapped in situation we helped create. But I can say I'm sorry, and mean it. They talked for an hour, Chen explaining how the network had operated, how they'd identified vulnerable farmers and exploited their desperation, how the entire system had been designed to make exit nearly impossible once someone was involved. It was education in predatory economics that Marcus wished he'd had years earlier, understanding that might have helped him recognize what his father was experiencing before it was too late. He tried to get out, Chen said quietly, multiple times, but we were good at creating dependencies, at making people believe they had no choice but to continue. Your father was smarter than most, though. The sabotage he did, the records he kept, that took courage we didn't anticipate. He was fighting back the whole time, even when it looked like compliance. After Chen left, Marcus sat alone in the kitchen, where generations of Brennans had shared meals and made decisions, feeling the weight of his father's struggle in new way. Harold hadn't been weak man who'd surrendered to temptation, but strong man who'd fought battle. Marcus was only now beginning to fully appreciate. The victory might have been Pyrrhic, might have cost him his health and ultimately his life, but it was victory nonetheless, resistance that had eventually contributed to dismantling system that had exploited him. Spring returned with its perpetual promise of renewal, fields responding to attention with productivity that felt almost grateful. Marcus worked alongside Emma and their hired help, teaching what he knew while learning from their fresh perspectives, finding balance between tradition and innovation that honored past without being imprisoned by it. The eastern fields where Harold's ashes had been scattered produced exceptional crop that year, yields that exceeded anything Marcus had achieved before. It was probably coincidence, soil chemistry and weather patterns aligning favorably, but Marcus preferred to interpret it as his father's final contribution, minerals from his bones feeding earth that would feed others, physical completion of cycle that had defined his entire life. On quiet morning in late May, Marcus walked the property line his great-grandfather had established, following fence posts that marked boundary between Brennan land and the wider world. The posts were old now, weathered grey and leaning, but they still stood, still served their purpose, still declared that this ground belonged to people who'd worked it long enough to earn that claim. He thought about legacy, about what it meant to inherit not just land, but the accumulated choices of everyone who'd held it before. His great-grandfather had cleared forest and established fields. His grandfather had mechanized and expanded. His father had struggled and compromised and ultimately fought to preserve what he'd nearly lost. And Marcus himself had chosen to continue, to accept the burden and blessing both, to transform what he'd inherited into something worth passing forward. Emma found him there, bringing coffee and the comfortable silence of someone who understood that some moments required witnessing rather than interruption. They stood together looking over fields that stretched toward horizon. Land their family had held through war and depression and personal catastrophe. Ground that had absorbed their ancestors' dreams and disappointments and would someday absorb their own. "Think we'll make it?" Emma asked quietly. "Keep this place alive for another generation?" Marcus sipped his coffee, considering the question honestly. "I think we'll try. And I think that's all anyone can do, put in the work, Make the choices. Hope that something good comes from effort. The land doesn't guarantee anything except opportunity. What we make of that opportunity, that's on us. The sun climbed higher, burning off morning mist that had settled in low areas, revealing fields in sharp clarity that afternoon would soften. It was beginning of another growing season, another cycle of planting and tending and harvesting, another year of making decisions that would shape what this place became. Marcus felt his father's presence not as ghost, but as integration, Harold's wisdom and failures both incorporated into understanding that informed every choice. The pumpkin's secret had been terrible gift, forcing confrontation with truth that comfort would have avoided, but truth that ultimately enabled healing impossible through continued ignorance. The land stretched before them, patient and persistent, ready to receive whatever they chose to plant, willing to yield whatever their effort earned. It was all any farmer could ask, all any generation could offer the next. Honest ground, honest work, honest hope that something good would grow from seed and sweat and sacrifice. And in the eastern fields, where Harold Brennan had become soil that would feed corn and soybeans and whatever else was planted there, young maple trees reached toward sky, with branches that would someday provide shade for farmers not yet born, carrying forward the complicated legacy of a man who'd made mistakes trying to protect something worth protecting, who'd fought back when fighting seemed impossible, whose final gift to his son had been truth buried in a giant pumpkin that had grown enormous from secrets fed into its roots. The Brennan farm would continue, changed but unbroken, tended by hands that understood legacy wasn't about perfection, but about persistence, about showing up season after season to do the work that land required, to make the choices that honor both past and future, to plant seeds in dark soil and trust that light would follow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.